Tourism ranger and interpretive ranger, so I've given this speech many times, and I have a master's degree in historical education from the College of Charleston. Let me try to get out of the sun here. It's great because I do people your age, and we do it in schools. So this is the second grader version of the Revolutionary War. Ready? In 5 seconds. We won! There we go. We didn't win, but they did. Revolutionary War. Revolutionary War was huge. Bear that in mind. We won. A lot of historians, no disrespect to anybody that was in Vietnam, a lot of historians compare it to Vietnam. Britain was the #1 supreme power of the world at that point, and when we started, we didn't even have an army, and we won the battle. The other thing is the first modern democracy we had formed since ancient Greek and Roman times. So really, the fact that we won and formed our country is huge. Kings and queens bowed to us the first time, ever, both in France and mostly in England. He didn't actually bow, but let's face it, we beat him, King George. Some of the modern approaches that historians have in the Revolutionary War, it's in 3 phases now. And the southern phase is so much more important than it has gotten in the past when you were taught history. For example, when we were in public school learning history, I don't think a thing was taught about the Southern campaign. The 3 phases. First phase, the phase of discontent. They talked about the Stamp Act, the gentleman that preceded me. It's about 1770 to 1774. 1770, Boston Massacre. 1773, 1774, the Stamp Act, taxation without representation, and we started to have the Tea Parties. What a lot of people don't realize is they had a Tea Party, of course the famous one in Boston, there was one in Philadelphia, there was one in Annapolis, Maryland, and there was one right here in Charleston. Us being Southerners, so polite, however, what we did was, when we knew a British boat full of tea was coming, we would send a boat out there and we would say, look, if you're going to dock in Charleston, we're going to pour out all your tea into the harbor, so we suggest you don't come. So we were a little more gentlemanly about it. So 1774, the king finally, he's mad, everyone's mad. Here's the thing, the East Indian Tea Company was a quasi-governmental organization. Can you tell I'm a tax attorney? It was half owned privately, half owned by the government. So when we were pouring tea into the harbor, it was a direct insult to the king. So a lot of Brits were very furious at us. 1774, the king declares all 13 colonies in a state of rebellion. He starts sending ships and more troops. And that's when we start forming up militias and we start forming up our government. Our forefathers, they knew in the beginning they were going to win this thing. So 1774 on to about 1779, you got the Continental Congress, and you got George Washington. God bless that man. He's the father of our country, probably because apparently he slept everywhere, but we won't go there. But really, our forefathers, you just got that. Our forefathers, I mean, there were 2 governments while most of the Revolutionary War was going on. There was a British colonial government, and there was a Patriot Continental governor. And at Charleston, I think they switched like 7 or 8 times, depending on who held Charleston. But every colony had 2 sets: the governor, the local sheriff, the local tax collector. There was one representing the Continental Congress and the colonial British representative. So we started to form a government from the beginning, and the thing was, we were ready to be our own country. The population of North America, historians estimate in 1776, 3.5 million people. That includes the African American slaves, that includes the indigenous, 3.5. The population of Britain in 1776, 7.5 million. We had half their population already. We were ready for self-government. 1776, Declaration of Independence, yay. We declare it. George Washington does his thing. Again, God bless the man. You gotta wonder, Valley Forge, the worst part of the war for him. They were freezing, he was ill-supplied. I know we put George on a pedestal, but you gotta wonder, he was having a man freeze to death on guard duty about every third night when they were at Valley Forge. He had to have been crying in his tent. What was worse is the bad winter, worst winter on record, was actually kind of a godsend. He was down to maybe 1,500 troops. They were either sick or just went home. The British, meanwhile, were in New York. The British held New York the entire war with like 10,000 troops. They totally could have marched over and finally annihilated his army, but it was such a hard winter. We go forward, 1779. George has finally a professional veteran full army, 10,000 troops. He is well supplied. He has got bayonets. Bear in mind, the Kentucky rifles, you couldn't put a bayonet on. The bayonet charge by the British was like a secret weapon that not many armies had. So 1779, George has artillery, he's well equipped. The British are still in New York, and it's called a stalemate. They know, they're not dumb, they know they cannot fight each other. It would be catastrophe. George can't fight them, and they're not gonna fight him. So the British actually came up with quite a logical plan. They're like, we're gonna invade the South, and we're gonna roll up the South, and they knew the northern colonies could not survive from the southern colonies. Yes, they had tried to conquer Charleston in 1776 unsuccessfully, but now it was 1779, and they're gonna come down here, and actually it was very good military strategy. They come down here, very late fall, November, December 1779. They go to Savannah, Georgia. Boom, Savannah falls. They come here to Charleston. It took a few months, and this is where Cornwallis comes in now. They get Charleston in a siege. We won't talk about General Benjamin Lincoln, who was the general in charge of the Continental troops. The fall of Charleston, and by the way, he surrendered, was our worst defeat. I think it was, it varies, they say, from 2,500 to 5,000 troops. It varies because there was a lot of militia. The Continentals in the blue uniforms, they were taken prisoner. But the British, the militia that was in civilian clothes that were part of the Continental Army, they let them go, they had to take an oath. So that's why if you read in the history, it varies. I've seen 2,500, I've seen 3,500, I've seen 5,000. So Charleston falls. Cornwallis is like, man, I'm on a roll. This is like working out great. And this is Fort Johnson, right here on James Island. This was manned. This is the 33rd Regiment of Foot, as Mr. Shawn. This is their fancy lacing. That's how they separated the regiments. The coat was different colors, the lacing was different colors. We were actually here. We were stationed here. In fact, we were stationed here through the war. Half our unit went through the Carolinas and surrendered at Yorktown. But when we surrendered at Yorktown, our colors were right here at this fort because the other half was here. So we were the only regiment in the British Army at Yorktown that surrendered, but we didn't surrender our colors. The rest of them had to. We were like the Forrest Gump of units. We were in just about every single battle in the entire war, but most important, we were here. So Cornwallis is here. Now it's spring of 1780. He's taken Charleston. And so now the plan comes, he's gonna go up Route 95, basically. He's gonna go up Route 95. He's gonna resupply numerous forts. For example, Camden, little old Camden was actually a central town. If you went from Charlotte or Raleigh to Charleston, you went through Camden back then. It was like the south of the border of, back then. So, I refer to 95, roughly. He's gonna go up through the center of South Carolina, center of North Carolina. He's gonna reinforce all the garrisons. They're gonna have control of the Carolinas. Then he's gonna take Virginia. It's gonna mark the end of the war. The northern colonies aren't gonna make it. So the other thing, so the first battle was Camden. Washington sent even more troops down here, and he sent a few thousand down here to General Benjamin Lincoln, no relation to Abe Lincoln, after he, to defend Charleston. Of course, they surrendered. So he said even more. Battle of Camden, the British totally destroyed Gates's army. So Washington didn't have any more troops to send down. Cornwallis comes back to Charleston, he resupplies, and everybody knows, the British, George Washington, the Continental Army, all 13 colonies know that Cornwallis is down here with 5,000 to 8,000 troops, and there's no army down here to stop him. Absolutely none. His plan is just going to happen. So he starts marching inland and starts going up. But what happened was, one of the first battles was Monk's Corner. And he got to Monk's Corner, and all of a sudden, there were like 500, 700, 800 militia. Continental militia, U.S. militia. And they fought, he defeated them. And he's like, well, this is just a fluke, it's the locals. Well, he starts going up through South Carolina, and there's battle after battle after battle. And this is not in order, Waxhaws, Kings Mountain, etc. And then when he gets into North Carolina, there's the Horseshoe, and the last one is in Greensboro, North Carolina, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. But let's get back to South Carolina. Where are these guys coming from? And the thing is, every battle, there's more of them, and he defeats them. And so, where are these guys coming from? Like, instead of 500 or 800 now, he's having an open battle with 1,000 or 2,000. Not to mention the fact that several, like Francis Marion, is just harassing his lines, making lots of trouble. So, the British didn't do their homework. Most of the planters, the wealthy plantation owners here on the coast, they kind of like the British. They didn't care about taxation without representation. They had lots of money, and actually they bought most of their stuff from Britain. But what they didn't do their homework was the Midlands and the upstate, especially the upstate. Those were the trappers, the pioneer families, the hunters, the skinners, people that lived off the land. First of all, they didn't care about the tax. They didn't pay any tax. They didn't care about taxation without representation. The British wasn't out there. But they were from Ireland, Scotland, and the Scotch-Irish. And they did not like the British, and they did not want to live under British rule. So these guys were hunters. But their Kentucky flintlocks, they were wicked accurate, which made up for the fact that they didn't have bayonets. They were coming down in droves. South Carolina, they estimate, again in 1776, there was 100,000 people. And out of that, about 40,000 lived here on the coast, 60,000 lived inland. So they keep coming, Cornwallis keeps fighting, they win most of the battles. Some of them they lost. In fact, as soon as they lose the first battle, all of a sudden, all the people on the coast, they called them loyalists, they changed sides. So that's how loyal they were. They switched from the British to the American. They're like, okay, we can see where this is going. So he's going through the Carolinas, Guilford Courthouse. This is another attribute to the British Army. Cornwallis is down to 1,500 troops. By now, George Washington's like, I see what's going on here. This is great. He sends a couple thousand troops down, finally. And Camden was 1,500 against 3,500 Continental and militia. Vastly, he was more than 2 to 1, and he soundly defeated them. Soundly. Not Camden, Guilford Courthouse. I'm sorry, I'm in North Carolina now, in Greensboro. He soundly defeated him. It was the last major battle of the Carolinas campaign. Cornwallis now is down to about 900 to 1,000 troops. His army is crippled. Bear in mind, he started out with 5,000 troops. He sailed down here with 10,000 troops originally. So he crawls into Virginia, he crawls into the Yorktown, and then we know the famous the French fleet shows up, finally. And finally, George Washington comes down from New Jersey and attacks Yorktown, and that was the beginning of the end of the war, and then it would take 2 more years to sign the treaty, and we became a country. Yay, go USA. All right, the town of James Island, thanks you so much for coming, and I thank you. And I turn it over to Sean.
Thank you, Mike. So folks, for our big finale, we're going to turn things over to the Kingsbury Artillery. If I could ask you, you could stay seated if you like, but if you'd like a closer view of the drill operations and... what's that? Who's talking?
Oh, I wasn't done yet.
Oh, we got no...
5
excuse...
minutes of entertainment for you guys.
Well, the Mike should introduce you. All right, we got one more.
All right, so there's my minion. Bring him. Come on, man. We are the 33rd Regiment, and pardon me if I don't look very soldierly because I'm the company tailor. Not really care what's going on with the battle as long as my men are well dressed. Now, speaking of the 33rd, we came over here not quite in the beginning of the war, but as the hostilities increased. We were in Savannah for the debauchery down there led by the French. We crossed the river and we came up to this island. We ended up here at Fort Johnson, and this is where we staged what we did for most of the rest of the war. Yes, we were involved in the 1776 debauch over there. It wasn't our fault. We got bad intel. So this is just leading into all of that, trying to keep it short and sweet. This is our regimental flag. Okay, very important point. It's just a reproduction of the flag, but we wanted you to get this flag in your mind because, as somebody said earlier, this flag was not surrendered. This is Major William Darcy. Now, Major William Darcy, Cornwallis had Major Darcy, Major Nutt, Lieutenant Colonel Webster. His subordinate officers were some of the best in the British Army, and they were under Cornwallis's command. Now, Major Darcy here was injured at Saratoga. He lost his small finger and part of this digit. And historically, when you had paintings made, if you had any type of wound like that, it would come up in the picture. So the fact that his hand's tucked inside his vest is to let you know that he was wounded in service. Now, Major Darcy was here at Fort Johnson with the light infantry. The light infantry, the 33rd had the grenadiers, the guys in the big tall hats. They had the light infantry, which our representative isn't here today. Different uniform, different jobs. Small guys, spry, probably the size of Jared here. They were the flank companies. They would go out in the woods, engage the enemy before the main part of the army, which were the foot soldiers, the Foot Regiment, would show up. The grenadiers were there for shock and awe. Guys that were 6 foot, 7 foot tall with big hats, big giant guys, lots of brass, really scary things. When your average militiaman, your little hometown guy came out up against 300 of those guys, that's what the purpose was, shock and awe. So going into it, just quickly, a couple crazy things about the regiment. As far as the material culture was concerned, we came down here in the south. It was really hot. We were dressed like this. We cut our uniforms down. We took and modified our hats. They basically turned them around, just silly little things to do. We wore hats like this. So now we got a little bit of sunshade. In the beginning of the war, one of our regiments, about 120 guys, got on the wrong ship and were sent to Quebec. And when they got to Quebec, General Burgoyne liked the look of the light soldiers, the light infantry had a different uniform or different hats. So he said, hey, take those hats, cut them all up, and turn them into light infantry hats. And that's what this is. It's the exact same hat with a horsetail. That's the only thing he liked about the light infantry was their hats. So he had his whole army, 1,000 guys, take their hats and cut them up and turn them into this. A couple months later, nah, I don't like that anymore. You guys get the regular hats back. That's just how the British Army officers were. They were just finicky that way. So going back to Dill's Bluff, it's the end of the war. Cornwallis has already gone off to Yorktown. A lot of people don't know that Cornwallis sent word to New York when they first saw the French fleet. Don't send us any more men. We have lost this fight. We don't want to lose any more of the King's men or ammunition or ships. This is over. You know, we're going to surrender. So they could have sent help. The siege of Yorktown could have went on for another month, but the disease and everything was going on. The French did show up finally. They wouldn't come to Charleston. They asked the French twice to come and help them in Charleston. The French said, so, true story. So, here we go. Now it's the end of the war. Yorktown's over. Some of the sergeants and ensigns from the 33rd refused to surrender, so they snuck back to South Carolina. When it came time, as Mike said earlier, traditionally within the military, a regimental flag is given to you by the king. It's a very important piece of equipment. they would cut the flags up so everybody in the regiment would have a little remnant. And when they asked for the colors to be given up at Yorktown, the flag wasn't there. They assumed they cut them all up. Where was the flag? Right here, Fort Johnson. It was in the baggage. So that was, and it ended up going back to England. Now, Dill's Bluff. Dill's Bluff's kind of a gray area. You'll hear stories of what happened. You'll hear stories of somebody turned their back on the colonials and went down there and told the British that they were going to come and ambush the foraging party. Not so by what I've been reading from the British accounts. Major Darcy was in charge, and he was a really good officer, and what he was doing, he was sending out parties up and down the coast looking for information, and he saw these other people spying and running. So they came back and said, look, Major Darcy, something's going on. So Major Darcy got the light infantry and some of the grenadiers, and we're waiting for these guys that came down. Now the people that came down were not militia. They were the 2nd Pennsylvania and the 1st Maryland of the Continental Army. They were up on James Island. And they came down, and Darcy and the 33rd Lights, which were probably the best force in the Army, went out to meet them. They had an exchange. There were 5 colonials killed. 2 of them were officers, 5 were wounded. On the British side, 2 men were killed and 3 were wounded. It ended up as technically a stalemate, but the British interpretation of it was that they pushed the colonial forces 6 or 7 miles up the coast to a river and forced them to cross the river to go back where they came from, and Darcy came back. At that point, they kind of got the word that it was time to evacuate. They loaded up about 100 people on the Betsy, wounded soldiers. The sickness got the grenadiers really, really bad. There were a lot of grenadiers left behind, and they were well enough to get back on the ships and go up to New York at the end of the war. And the Americans said, okay, you loyalist British, if you want to go back to England, that's just fine with us. But they gave them no protection whatsoever. They were at the mercy of the civilians that were wanting revenge for the entirety of the war. And the 33rd was up there to protect the loyalists as they were disembarking on ships. We were basically the last British people militarily to leave American soil. And then we went back to England. Of course, Cornwallis went to India. Major Darcy ended up being the aide-de-camp to King George III, which is basically the king's military advisor. That's just how good he was. But it was all based on what they did here at Fort Johnson, which makes us really interested to come down and do this for you guys, because we were basically here for 6 years and 6 months, from technically the beginning of the war, when we came over to do the first incursions against Fort Moultrie in '76, to the entire siege, to everything else, the 33rd. I don't know why Charleston didn't adopt us. They should have. But that's why we were here, and that's why we're here, to kind of share those ins and outs of you concerning the regiment. So that's all I got to say. You can have cannons now. Oh, great.
Thank you so much.